Flathead County, Montana. Late October, 1946. The most respected builder in the valley stood in front of a half-buried steel arch and shook his head. That, Jonas Millwright said loud enough for the men at the lumber yard to hear, is the most dangerous, foolish thing I've seen in 30 years of construction. The object of his contempt? A war-surplus Quonset hut, one of thousands of curved steel shelters being sold off cheap after the war ended. And inside that rippled metal shell, a returning veteran named Robert Dutch, Hendricks was building something nobody had seen before. What did Dutch understand about thermal protection that the expert builders missed? Why did the worst idea in Montana, homesteading, become the most copied design within 5 years? Today, you're going to see how a laughingstock became a lifeline, and why the coldest winter in 2 decades proved one stubborn carpenter right, while an entire community learned they've been building wrong all along. If you want to learn one real survival technique every week, methods that actually worked when lives hung in the balance, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's begin. Robert Hendricks came back from the Pacific in May of 1946 with a toolbox, a small veteran's loan, and plans to homestead near Columbia Falls. He'd grown up splitting wood for his grandfather's cabin, so he knew the reality. A traditional Montana log cabin could eat through 3 cords of firewood in a hard winter. And most of that heat? Gone. Straight through the chinks, up through the floorboards, sucked out by wind that hit those walls like a freight train. Dutch wasn't romantic about it. He'd spent 2 winters before the war helping repair cabins after blizzards, patching gaps with moss and mud, replacing frozen cracked logs, watching families shiver in their own homes while the stove roared and the woodpile shrank. The problem was simple: wind. The valleys funneled it, the peaks accelerated it, and those gusts hit every seam, every corner, every weak point in a log wall. A cabin that felt solid in September turned into a sieve by January. Families burned 4, sometimes 5 cords of wood just trying to keep the temperature above freezing. Floors stayed cold. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and sometimes on the inside walls. Kids got sick. Wives complained. Men spent half their day splitting, hauling, stacking. He'd seen it happen to the Andersons 2 winters before he enlisted. Good family. Strong logs. Well chinked. They burned through 6 cords between November and March, and still ended up with frostbite cases among the children. The father told Dutch it felt like shoveling heat into a hole. No matter how much wood you fed that stove, the cold just kept pressing into the walls. "I can feel the wind inside my own house," he'd said, exhausted and bitter. Dutch also remembered old Henry Volkman, a German immigrant who'd built his cabin back in 1923 using techniques from the Black Forest. Solid construction, thick walls, heavy door. But Henry spent every winter complaining about the same thing: draft. Cold air crawling across the floor like invisible water. Heat rising and disappearing through the roof. The stove glowing red-hot in the center of the room while your back froze if you stood 10 feet away. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was expensive. A man could spend half his yearly labor just keeping his family warm. Cutting trees, hauling logs, splitting rounds, stacking cords, and then feeding that fire every few hours, day and night, for 5 solid months. That was time you couldn't spend trapping, hunting, working, building, or doing anything else that mattered. The house owned you. But what really bothered Dutch was the waste. All that labor, all that fuel, and for what? A house that barely hit 60 degrees when it was 20 below outside. So when he saw the ad in the Great Falls Tribune, war surplus Quonset huts, $500, you haul, he didn't see military junk. He saw a windbreak, a shell, a thermal envelope that could take the punishment while a real cabin stayed protected inside. He bought one. A 20 by 48-foot steel arch drove it back on a flatbed, set it on a gravel pad, and started building a wooden cabin inside it. The locals thought he'd lost his mind. Dutch didn't care. He'd done the math. He'd thought it through. The Quonset would shrug off the wind. The air gap between the steel and the inner wooden walls would act as insulation. The wooden cabin inside would stay dry, stay warm, and consume half the firewood of a standard build. That was the theory. But theory doesn't mean much in Montana when the temperature drops and your neighbors are watching. Here's what Dutch built, step by step. First, the foundation, a low stone and gravel base, graded for drainage, with a vapor barrier underneath. The Quonset hut bolted directly onto that base, curved ribs of corrugated steel forming a half-cylinder, 16 feet tall at the peak, sealed at both ends with plywood gables. Inside that shell, Dutch left a 4-foot air gap on all sides. Then he framed a traditional 12 by 40 cabin using milled lumber, 2 by 6 studs, proper corners, a gabled roof structure that didn't touch the steel arch above it. Between the inner wooden walls and the outer steel, he packed the air gap with sawdust insulation, old wool blankets, and burlap sack stuffed with dry straw. He ran the stovepipe through both walls, inner wood, then outer steel, with a 6-inch clearance and a spark arrestor on top. The entry was double-doored, one door on the Quonset, one door on the cabin, creating an airlock vestibule. He installed small vents near the floor and ceiling to allow slow air circulation and prevent moisture buildup. The floor system was just as deliberate. Dutch laid down a subfloor of rough-cut planks over the gravel base, then added a layer of tar paper, then a finished floor of tongue and groove pine. The result was a suspended wooden floor that never touched the frozen ground directly. Cold couldn't conduct up from below because there was an air gap and insulation between the earth and where people walked. The windows were double-hung and set into the inner wooden walls only, not the steel shell. This meant the glass sat inside the insulated envelope, protected from direct wind contact. Dutch caulked every seam with oakum and tar. He wasn't trying to make it airtight, but he was trying to control where air moved. Ventilation needed to be intentional, not accidental. He even thought about thermal mass. Inside the cabin, he built a small masonry alcove behind the wood stove using river rock and fire clay. The stones would absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, smoothing out temperature swings. It wasn't a full Russian stove, but it borrowed the same principle. Store heat in mass, release it slowly. It was clever. It was unconventional. And to every experienced builder in Flathead County, it was idiotic. Metal sweats, Jonas Millwright said flatly when he saw it. You're going to have condensation dripping on that wood all winter. By spring, the whole inside structure will be rotted and useless. Others were harsher. You're building a cold trap, Hendrix. Steel doesn't hold heat. It radiates cold. You'll burn 3 times the wood just trying to warm up that metal shell. That's not a cabin. That's a warehouse. A grain shed. You think you're outsmarting the mountain, but you're just hiding from it. What kind of man won't face winter like his grandfather did? It wasn't just skepticism. It was contempt. Dutch wasn't following the rules. He was using military surplus. Cheap, ugly, untraditional. It didn't look like a homestead. It looked like a man who didn't belong. The aesthetics bothered people almost as much as the engineering. A log cabin had dignity. It looked like it belonged in the mountains. It said, I built this with my hands from the trees around me. But a Quonset hut? That said, I bought surplus junk and hid inside it. There was no craftsmanship people could see, no hand-hewn beams, no stacked stone chimney visible from the road. Just a big curved sheet of ribbed metal that looked like it belonged on an airfield, not a homestead. Some of the criticism was practical. What happens when snow builds up on that curved roof? One man asked. It's going to slide off in an avalanche and kill someone walking past. Another worried about lightning. You put up the tallest metal structure in the valley, and you think that's safe? A third pointed out resale value. Who's going to buy that when you're done? You've ruined the land value. But Dutch had thought about the criticism. He knew metal conducted heat, but he also knew it conducted heat away from the source, meaning the Quonset shell would never get warm enough to matter. The inner cabin, insulated and windproof, would hold heat just fine. And condensation? He'd built in ventilation, vapor barriers, and drainage. He wasn't guessing. He was engineering. The real question wasn't whether it would work. The real question was whether it would work well enough to prove the critics wrong. And for that, he'd need a test. A cold one. Jonas Millwright didn't just criticize Dutch privately. He made it a point to do it publicly, at the lumber yard, at the trading post, anywhere men gathered to talk about weather and work. I've been building in these mountains for 30 years, Jonas said one afternoon in early November, leaning against the counter at Halvorson's general store. And I'm telling you, That contraption Hendricks put up is a death trap. You don't insulate with air. You don't trust metal in a Montana winter. And you sure as hell don't build a house inside another house like some kind of Russian nesting doll. The men laughed. Not mean laughter, just the easy ridicule of men who know their trade and spot an outsider trying something strange. I give it until January, one of them said. He'll be begging for a room at the boarding house when that steel freezes and the whole thing turns into an icebox. Another chimed in, or burns down. You put a stove inside a wooden box inside a metal box and see what happens when a spark lands wrong. Jonas nodded, serious now. That's the real danger. It's not just foolish. It's dangerous. He's got no airflow, no proper clearance, no understanding of how fire behaves in a confined space. Someone's going to get hurt. He turned to the group, his voice firm. Any of you thinking about copying that setup, don't. Build it right. Logs, chink proper, stone foundation, good stove clearance. It's been working for 100 years. There's a reason we build the way we do. The criticism spread beyond the builders. At the Sunday service in early December, Reverend Paulson made an indirect reference that everyone understood. A man who builds his house on gimmicks and shortcuts, he said from the pulpit, may find that when the storm comes, his foundation fails him. Wisdom comes from tradition, from the knowledge passed down by those who survived before us. People nodded. A few glanced toward where Dutch usually sat, though he wasn't there that morning. He'd stopped attending church 3 weeks earlier, tired of the sideways looks and the whispered comments during coffee hour. At the schoolhouse, Dutch's neighbor Margaret Tollefson told the other mother she was worried. I don't want to speak ill, she said quietly, but what if there's a fire? Those children of his, they're trapped inside 2 layers of building. How do they get out? Another woman agreed. And that steel gets cold. I've touched a metal fence in winter. It burns your hand. Imagine living inside a metal shell. And it wasn't just the builders. The social judgment was just as sharp. A real cabin faces winter head-on, one trapper said. You don't hide behind tin like a scare dog. My grandfather built his cabin with an axe and a drawn knife, another added. Didn't need war surplus. Didn't need shortcuts. The women were kinder, but no less doubtful. I hope he knows what he's doing, Dutch's neighbor, Mary Callahan, said quietly. It'd be a shame if he froze, because he was too proud to build normal. Even the men who respected Dutch's work ethic, and there were several, thought he'd miscalculated. Good carpenter, one said. But this is stubbornness, not smarts. The judgment got personal. At the post office, Dutch overheard 2 men talking as if he wasn't standing right there. That Quonset thing makes the whole valley look like a junkyard, one said. Bad enough we got old cars rusting in fields. Now we've got military garbage pretending to be a home. The other nodded. Disrespectful, if you ask me. Men died in this war. And he's taking their shelter and turning it into some kind of experiment. There's something off about that. Even Dutch's own cousin, a logger named Raymond, pulled him aside one evening and tried to talk sense into him. Robert, I know you're smart. I know you think you've figured something out. But you're making people uncomfortable. You're making yourself a target. Just build a normal cabin. You can afford it. You've got the skills. Why die on this hill? Dutch heard all of it. He didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. Just kept working, kept insulating, kept building. He knew words didn't mean anything. Only winter did. And winter was coming. Late December, 1946. The cold front hit on the 19th. Not the usual Montana cold, the kind that bites but passes. This was the kind that settled in, dug down, and refused to leave. By December 22nd, the thermometer outside the Flathead County Courthouse read -18 Fahrenheit. By Christmas Eve, it was -27. On December 28th, it dropped to -35 and stayed there for 6 straight days. The wind made it worse. Gusts hit 50 miles per hour, screaming down from the peaks, funneling through the valleys, slamming into every structure in its path. Snowdrifts buried fences. Livestock huddled in barns. And the people? They burned wood like it was going out of style. Traditional cabins suffered. Families woke to ice on the inside of their walls. Floors were so cold you couldn't walk barefoot. Stoves ran day and night, and still the temperature inside barely crept past 50 degrees. Men hauled cord after cord from their woodpiles, splitting frozen logs with numb hands, feeding the fire every 2 hours just to keep it alive. The Johnsons, who lived about 3 miles east of Dutch, ran through 2 full cords in the first week of the cold snap. Their eldest son, barely 16, spent every daylight hours splitting and hauling. His hands blistered, then bled, then went numb. His father kept saying, "Just a few more days. It'll break." But it didn't break. By New Year's Eve, people were getting desperate. The trading post ran low on kerosene. Families started burning furniture, chairs, old bed frames, anything that would catch. One family tried burning green wood out of desperation and filled their cabin with so much smoke they had to evacuate into their barn for the night, shivering with the horses. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Frostbite cases started showing up. A trapper lost 2 toes. A child's ear turned black from exposure during the walk to the outhouse. The county doctor made house calls on horseback, bundled in so many layers he could barely move, checking for hypothermia and pneumonia. Some families couldn't keep up. The Callahans ran out of dry wood by New Year's Day. Everything left in their pile was snow-soaked and wouldn't catch. They moved in with Mary's sister 10 miles south. The Bergstroms lasted until January 3rd, then packed up the kids and headed to town. "We'll come back when it thaws," Mr. Bergstrom said. Nobody blamed him. The wind was relentless. It found every gap, every seam, every weak point. Chinked logs that seemed tight in autumn turned into sieves in January. Doors rattled. Windows whistled. Heat poured out as fast as the stoves could produce it. Jonas Millwright's own cabin, built solid, built right, built the traditional way, was struggling. He fed the stove every 90 minutes through the night. His wife wore 2 coats indoors. The water bucket by the door froze solid every morning, even though it sat 8 feet from the fire. Jonas didn't complain out loud, but his face showed the exhaustion. This was the worst cold he'd seen in 30 years, and his proper cabin was barely holding on. Men started checking on each other, not out of charity, out of survival instinct. If your neighbor ran out of wood or couldn't keep a fire going, you might be next. The community pulled together in small ways, sharing dry kindling, lending axes, checking that smoke was still rising from chimneys. And through it all, Dutch Hendrick stayed put in his steel-arch cabin, smoke rising steady from his chimney, light glowing warm through his windows. People noticed. On January 4th, a Sunday, Raymond stopped by Jonas Millwright's place on his way back from checking trap lines. "You been past Dutch's place?" he asked. Jonas nodded, pulling on his gloves to go split more wood. "I have. Smoke's thin," Raymond said. "Real thin. Like he's barely burning anything." Jonas grunted. "Probably froze to death, and the fire's just dying slow." But Raymond shook his head. "Saw him yesterday. Walked right past. He was outside in his shirt sleeves, splitting a log." "Shirt sleeves?" Jonas. "In -30. Jonas stopped, stared, said nothing. "I'm just saying," Raymond continued. "Maybe we should check on him. Make sure he's all right." Jonas looked at the snow, then back at his own cabin, then at the thin column of smoke rising from Dutch's Quonset hut 1.5 miles across the valley. "Yeah," he said finally. "Maybe we should. Stay with me, because what happens next silenced the proper method forever." Jonas Millwright and Raymond arrived at Dutch's place just after noon on January 5th. The temperature had climbed to a balmy -22. They expected to find Dutch huddled near his stove, burning through his woodpile, maybe in trouble. What they found stopped them cold. Dutch was outside, working in his shed, wearing a flannel shirt and a light jacket. Not the heavy wool coat everyone else had been living in for 2 weeks. Not the double layers and scarves and gloves. Just normal work clothes. "Afternoon," Dutch said, looking up from the saw bench. "Something I can help you with?" Jonas stared. "You feeling all right, Dutch?" "Fine," Dutch said. "Why?" Raymond pointed at the cabin. "Your chimney's barely smoking. We thought maybe your fire went out. Thought you might need help." Dutch smiled. "Just a little. Fire's going. Just doesn't need much feeding." Jonas walked closer to the Quonset hut, suspicious now. He put his hand near the steel wall, expecting it to be frozen, expecting to feel the bite of cold metal. It was cool. Not frozen. Not burning cold. Just cool, like a shaded stone in summer. Can we come in? Jonas asked. Dutch nodded. Doors open. They stepped through the outer door, the Quonset entrance. There was a small vestibule, maybe 4 feet deep, with hooks for coats and a bench for boots. Then the inner door. Jonas opened it. The warmth hit him like a wave. Inside, the temperature was comfortable. Not just survivable. Comfortable. The kind of warmth you'd expect in October, not in the middle of the worst cold snap in 30 years. Raymond pulled off his glove and held his hand up, feeling the air. No cold drafts. No icy spots near the floor. Just even, steady warmth. The wood stove sat in the center of the cabin, but it wasn't roaring. The fire was low, a gentle burn, the kind you'd use for cooking, not for desperate heating. Behind the stove, the stone alcove Dutch had built glowed with stored heat, radiating warmth even though the fire itself was modest. Jonas walked to the wall and touched it. Dry. No condensation. No frost. No ice. Just dry, solid wood. He looked at the floor. No gaps. No cold air crawling across his boots. It felt insulated, stable, warm underfoot. Raymond checked the windows. A little frost on the outside, sure, but the inside glass was clear. No ice buildup. No frozen condensation running down the panes like every other cabin in the valley. What's the temperature in here? Jonas asked, his voice quiet now. Dutch glanced at a small thermometer hanging near the door. Holding around 68. 69 when the sun's out and hitting the south side of the Quonset. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Jonas's cabin, built the right way, the traditional way with 30 years of experience behind it, was holding at 52 degrees, and that was with him feeding the fire every 90 minutes, day and night, burning through it like a sawmill. Raymond walked the perimeter of the cabin, studying the construction. How much wood are you burning? He asked. Dutch shrugged. About a third of a cord since the cold hit. Maybe less. Jonas did the math in his head. He'd burned nearly 2 full cords in the same time period. Dutch was using 1/6 the wood and staying 20 degrees warmer. And you're not having any problems? Jonas asked, still looking for the flaw, the catch, the thing that proved this was a bad idea. No smoke backing up? No moisture issues? None, Dutch said. Stovepipe draws clean. Ventilation's working. No leaks, no drafts, no condensation. Raymond knelt down and inspected the gap between the inner wall and the outer Quonset shell. He could see the insulation, sawdust, wool, straw, packed tight but not compressed. Air could move through it slowly, just enough to prevent moisture buildup, but not enough to create convective heat loss. The steel shell, Raymond said slowly, working it out in his head. It's not heating up. It's just blocking the wind. Exactly, Dutch said. Wind hits the steel, slides off. Doesn't matter how hard it blows. The inner cabin never feels it, and the air gap insulates. The steel stays cold, the wood stays warm, and there's no thermal bridge between them. Jonas stood in the middle of the cabin, feeling the warmth, seeing the proof, and hating every second of it. Not because Dutch was wrong, because Dutch was right, and Jonas had been loudly, publicly, confidently wrong. You used river stone behind the stove, Jonas said, pointing at the alcove. Thermal mass, Dutch replied. Absorbs heat during the day, radiates it back at night. Keeps the temperature stable. I don't have to wake up every 2 hours to feed the fire. I load it once before bed, and it coasts until morning. Raymond looked at Jonas. Jonas looked at the floor. This whole time, Raymond said quietly, we thought you were crazy. Dutch didn't gloat, didn't smile, just nodded. I know. Jonas walked to the door, stopped, turned back. How much did the Quonset cost you? $500, Dutch said, plus the haul. Jonas thought about the cost of his own cabin. The logs, the labor, the chinking, the repairs every spring, the endless cords of wood. You're not burning 3 times the wood, Jonas said. You're burning 1/6. About that, Dutch confirmed. Jonas stepped outside into the cold. The wind hit him immediately, cutting through his coat, reminding him what winter felt like. He looked back at the Quonset hut, ugly, strange, out of place, and realized it didn't matter what it looked like. It worked, and his didn't. Word spread fast in a small valley, especially when the weather was too cold for anything but talk. By January 7th, half the men in Flathead County had heard about Jonas Millwright's visit to Dutch Hendrix's cabin, and they'd heard the numbers. 68 degrees inside, 1/6 the wood, no ice, no condensation, comfortable. At first, people didn't believe it. Jonas must have read the thermometer wrong, someone said at the trading post. Or Dutch was lying. But then Raymond confirmed it. And Raymond didn't lie. Then others started visiting, not to criticize, to see. One by one, families made the trip out to Dutch's place, usually with some excuse, borrowing a tool, dropping off firewood, checking on livestock, but really they wanted to see the inside of that Quonset cabin. And every single one of them walked out quiet. By mid-January, the temperature had climbed back up to a more normal 15 below zero, and people started taking stock of their wood supplies. The Johnsons had burned through 4.5 cords. The Bergstroms, who'd fled to town, came back to find their cabin frozen solid, with burst pipes and cracked mortar in the chimney. It took them 3 days of constant fire just to thaw the place enough to live in it again. Dutch had burned less than half a cord total. The math was undeniable. The proof was irrefutable. And slowly, grudgingly, the community started to change its mind. Jonas Millwright was the first to publicly reverse his position. He did it at Halvorson's General Store on a Saturday morning in late January, standing in the same spot where he'd called Dutch's cabin a death trap 2 months earlier. "I was wrong," Jonas said, his voice carrying across the store. The room went quiet. "I told you all that Hendrix's setup was dangerous and foolish. I said it wouldn't work. I said it loud, and I said it often." He paused, looked around at the faces watching him. "I was wrong. That cabin is the warmest, most efficient structure in this valley. I've been building for 30 years, and I didn't see what he saw. The steel shell blocks the wind. The air gap insulates. The mass stores heat. It's not pretty, but it works better than anything I've ever built." The silence stretched. Then someone asked, "So, should we all build Quonset cabins now?" Jonas shook his head. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying Dutch wasn't being stubborn or crazy. He was being smart. He saw a problem the rest of us had accepted as normal, and he solved it. That's not cowardice. That's engineering." The shift wasn't instant, but it was real. The mockery stopped. The jokes disappeared. People started asking Dutch questions. Real questions about materials, costs, insulation, ventilation. And some people started planning. By the spring of 1947, 2 families had purchased surplus Quonset huts and were modifying them for habitation. One family, the Granvilles, built theirs near Whitefish and added a layer of earth berming around the bays for extra insulation. Another, the Ridgeways, used double-wall construction with an even larger air gap and installed a masonry heater instead of a wood stove. Neither copied Dutch's design exactly. They adapted it, improved it, made it their own. By 1948, there were 7 modified Quonset dwellings in Flathead County. By 1950, the number had climbed to 23 within an 80-mile radius. Some were full-time homes. Others were seasonal hunting cabins, workshops, or storage buildings with living quarters attached. The designs varied. Some people kept the Quonset visible and painted it. Others buried it partially underground, turning it into a modern, earth-sheltered home. A few built log facades on the front to make it look more traditional from the road, while keeping the steel arch efficiency in the back. But they all shared the same principle. Use the steel shell to block wind, create an insulated air gap, and build the living space inside a protected envelope. Dutch's foolish idea had become a viable, proven, regional building technique. The cultural shift was subtle but significant. By the early 1950s, people stopped seeing Quonset huts as eyesores or military junk. They started seeing them as practical tools, another option in the toolkit of mountain survival, alongside log cabins, sod houses, and stone cottages. Dutch himself never marketed his design or claimed credit for inventing anything. When people asked him about it, he'd shrug and say, "I just didn't want to freeze." But the valley remembered, and the valley learned. In 1952, a young couple from Kalispell came out to Dutch's place and asked if they could measure his cabin and take notes. They were building their own homestead and wanted to replicate the system. Dutch walked them through it, explained the ventilation, the vapor barriers, the thermal mass, the clearances, gave him his measurements, answered every question. As they were leaving, the young man, barely 25, eager, respectful, asked Dutch one more question. Why did you share all this? You could have kept it secret, could have sold the plans or something. Dutch looked at him like the question didn't make sense. Because it works, he said, and people need to stay warm. That was it. No philosophy, no grand statement, just practical truth from a practical man. By the mid-1950s, Dutch's cabin had become a kind of landmark. People pointed it out to newcomers. That's the Hendricks place. First Quonset cabin in the valley. They laughed at him. Then they copied him. The story became part of the local lore, a reminder that wisdom doesn't always look traditional, that innovation often gets mocked before it gets adopted, and that the best ideas are the ones that solve real problems instead of protecting old assumptions. Jonas Millwright, to his credit, never tried to downplay his mistake. When people brought it up, he'd nod and say, I learned more from being wrong about Dutch's cabin than I learned from being right about 100 others. In the end, that's what the story was really about. Not about proving people wrong. Not about Dutch being a genius or Jonas being a fool. It was about recognizing that survival doesn't care about tradition or aesthetics or what people think looks right. Survival cares about what works. And sometimes, what works looks strange until you understand it. Dutch Hendricks understood thermal physics before he had the words for it. He understood that wind was the enemy, that insulation was geometry, and that heat storage mattered more than heat production. He built a cabin that proved those principles. And in doing so, he changed the way an entire region thought about shelter. The ancient wisdom wasn't in the logs, or the stone, or the traditional methods. The ancient wisdom was in observation, adaptation, and the willingness to try something new when the old way wasn't working. Dutch didn't reject tradition. He just refused to freeze for it. Which part of this solution would you apply to your home today? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. If you want more real survival techniques that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.